Good evening. I'm David Watts Jr. I'm the chair this year of the Wakefield Human Rights Commission, and I want to thank you for coming to this, the second of two talks of the 2017 speaker series, jointly sponsored by the Wakefield Human Rights Commission and the Unitarian Universalist Church's Social Action Committee. In the first talk on October 5th, we explored white privilege with Ken Wagner. This evening, we're exploring the other side of this core American issue with Martin Henson, Understanding Black Lives Matter. Martin is an activist, an organizer for Black Lives Matter Boston, and a mental health counselor. Among his interests are alternative community structures, dismantling white supremacy, as well as intersectional movement and coalition building. Martin hosts Black Lives Matter Boston's weekly radio program, Stay Woke with Martin Henson, each Thursday evening. Please welcome Martin Henson.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. You didn't have to come out here and listen to me talk. You could have done something else on Wednesday, like a Bible study or Netflix. But you came to be a part of this conversation. So thank you. I appreciate that. It's always cool to have an audience. A lot of times I'm doing the radio show stuff and I feel like I'm talking to myself. So to have real bodies out here is great. So just to introduce myself again, my name is Martin Henson. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm from Black Lives Matter Boston. And I go around a lot of times talking about the work that we do, having to define out for people what Black Lives Matter is, and kind of point out some of the things that happen within the world and some of our responses to those things. Because people don't really know what to think, don't know how to think about it, and sometimes the media narrative that you get from CNN or MSNBC or Fox or any of the other outlets, sometimes you get real news, sometimes you get fake news, but I want to give it to you real, how I see it, how I experience it. So I'm gonna have a very candid conversation, a very honest conversation, and I might curse a couple times. I just want to let you know, so you can be ready for it. I don't know what you're used to, but I'm not the activist of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm one of the millennial ones, you know. Got a new, fresh view, or at least that's how we like to feel about it. So Black Lives Matter started in reaction to the acquittal of Trayvon and Martin's death at the hands of George Zimmerman. And you know, what I always say is that, you know, what do you say when you watch a black person be put on trial for their own murder? Like, how do you respond to that? How do you respond to violence in general? But there's something like that very particular where you know all the details, you know that this kid was walking around with Skittles and iced tea, and somehow he ended up dead. And somehow the person who killed him is now held responsible for it. And knowing that situation, that issue is going to happen to somebody who looks like you every day, whether or not you know about it or not, what do you say to that? And you know, one of the founders, when posting a Facebook post, said at the end, #Black Lives Matter. And from that, there was an organizing, there was a forming of activists and artists and creatives who all want to do something and change the world and make an impact. And then from around that time, we saw a slew of violence toward black people, unarmed black folks. And the media is showing it now, it's promoting it. It's not that it's anything new, because this is what's been happening for a long time in a lot of backwoods areas, sometimes in a lot of urban city centers. People are killed and there's a spin put on it before you can really realize what really happened. So now you have the digital media wave where you catch the narrative before the media comes out and put their own twist on it, because a lot of times the media works hand in hand with the police department, and if they're not given information the way that it is prescribed to them, they won't always have access to crime scenes and be the first people to talk to. It's a lot of the ins and outs of how these systems work. So when you have something like the internet come out, people can give their own narratives and respond very quickly, and it kind of caught the wave or stepped ahead of it. So now you have things like this, where our narratives come out and it's very public, You had, Freddie Gray, Kai Gurley, Sandra Bland, having all these things that we know about now. Also, Mike Brown, there was uprising in Ferguson, and Mike Brown, as it relates to Black Lives Matter Boston, there was a call put out for people to come down there and get involved in the work. When I say uprising, typically the phrasing that is given to us by the media is riot, and which has a negative connotation. But when somebody is killing unarmed people in your community, there's no riot. It's a response of frustration and anger, and the people rise up to demand change. Maybe other ways would have been available before, but when you get to that tipping point, you have to do something a little bit differently. So when that happened with Mike Brown, there was a call for people to come down there, and people came from all over to get involved. And in Boston, there was a bus that came down with organizers who came together and did work as they saw fit, and came back, started a chapter of Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter Boston has been around since then. That was in 2014. So and I came on in 2015. It's 2017 now, and I've been doing it ever since then. With this type of work, I always have to kind of flesh things out and to understand it in a certain way and to communicate it in a certain way, so make sure people get it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go over some of the guiding principles. It's one of the first things I have to do to make sure that we're clear. A lot of times people think we don't have any principles. We just come out and get a couple of poster boards and magic markers and just run out in the streets, and it just doesn't happen that way. So let me tell you, so you heard it from me first, and hopefully you'll hear from other people if this is not the only incident that you're out trying to learn a little bit about it. So Black Lives Matter, one of the first principles that I always go with is that we're queer and transgender affirming. I believe it is important, or is absolutely important, that me as a male, cisgender male, that I say that first. Because the role in which our society plays towards queer and transgender people is often one that is violent, often one that is dictated by marginalization, is often one that tells people they need to be invisible, they need to hide somewhere, that we're not ready for you yet, that type of thing. And it's often done by people who look like me. So I have to start it off like that, be very clear that that's not the position that I'm taking. Also, Black Lives Matter is one that, one of our guiding principles is Black women. Black women have often been told to be second hands to Black men, and Black women started Black Lives Matter. Two of them being queer Black women, which puts me in a position where I'm, in complete, in a sense of gratitude towards them for giving me the opportunity to be able to speak to you all. There was no charismatic Black man with a sword and a machine gun on their side running around saying, like, let's start Black Lives Matter. That's not how it happened. Black women made that call. And I'm here because of the call that they made. I'm allowed to do this work because of the call they made. Not just for the fact that I've come from Black women, but in terms of the organizing practice, that's what I'm surrounded by. So I have to be clear about that connection and that and uplift them, because they are the people who have uplifted me and taught me so much. So that's another thing. Black Lives Matter is inclusive. A lot of times the narrative or the framework for who's strong and who's powerful means it typically goes to like a cisgender male, but also somebody who's in good health, somebody who doesn't have a criminal record. As you see, for people who know the history of Rosa Parks, it was no accident that Rosa Parks sat down on the bus that day. There had to be planning and strategy around who was able to do it and who the media would be able to cling to without trying to drag them through the mud, because she wasn't the first. We see that as it relates to people who have different mental health difficulties, people with different levels of ability. There's a tendency to focus on one type of person who can hold it up for everybody. And as it relates to Black Lives Matter, us being inclusive toward the Black community, I'm saying that's not true. So somebody who's Black, who's queer, who's trans, who is an immigrant, who's undocumented, who is formerly incarcerated, who has whatever level of ability or disability, they're able to step into these leadership roles. Because the truth is, these people have always been doing the work. It's just it's been limited to like here's a particular place for a particular type of person who's supposed to be able to hold it. So we want to make sure that we always say that, what inclusivity is and what that means. Also, we're one that's intergenerational. Also, I keep talking about these formations and these understandings of what the activist looks like. This able-bodied 17 through 28-year-old person who is in good health or something like that, or has a certain particular framing. But intergenerational, you can have 3 or 4 generations of people out here doing all types of work in the general movement of Black lives and also within Black Lives Matter. And let me direct your attention to Ferguson. Ferguson is still hot right now, still popping off. People still in the street organizing for the work that needs to be done at police officers killing unarmed Black folks. That hasn't stopped. So while we're focusing on whatever ridiculousness 45 is saying one day or the next, there's still grassroots organizing work is still being done. And a lot of times it's being done by mothers out there who have been victims of the system in one way or another, who know the understanding that if we don't deal with this now, this is going to affect my child, it's going to affect my child's child. So we're intergenerational in that. We also believe in Black villages, meaning Black communities coming together by whatever formation makes sense for you. That means thinking more than the 2-parent nuclear family. It's bigger than that. Is whatever family you have come to know and has come to hold you, whatever community has come to be there for you in your times of need and struggle, that's what we're thinking about. Ways to build that up, ways to get away from being told who, what, when, where, and how to do something, what's good enough and what's not good enough, who can come to the party and who can't, or as we say, Black folks, who can come to the cookout and who can't come to the cookout. With this type of work, everybody needs to be there because it's all hands on deck. Everybody's doing the work anyway. So why would you kind of limit it and say, well, this person can't do it, this person can't do it, this person can't do it. Also, we're international, or global, rather, in our understanding of the Black experience. Because Black isn't just limited to African Americans. Black is Haitian, Black is Nigerian, Black is Dominican, Black is Cape Verdean, Black is all these particular groups of people that have to deal with the Black experience. And as we've seen in, I want to say, I can't remember what country in Africa, just a terror attack that just happened, killed hundreds of people. It hasn't, which one was it? Somalia. It hasn't dominated the media coverage like our most recent attack in Vegas has, or like some other Western countries' terror attack has. We decide who's important and who's not. And when it comes to Black Lives Matter and folks like us, we have to hold that. We got to hold that for our people and say, and just like folks say, well, I'm Vegas or I am with France, I'm with Somalia too, and make sure that somebody hears our narrative, because it's nothing worse than to have to scream in the dark and nobody notices you or will care about what plight you're in. Not to mention American imperialism that goes around destabilizing countries and doesn't show you what's happening in the aftermath. It's a whole nother thing. But we have to be able to share each other's narrative. So like when something's going on in Brazil, then they let us know, Black Lives Matter in different chapters, hey, we're doing this, can you come support? And vice versa. If something's going on in the UK, to let us know, we can come support, and vice versa. Without having to deal with the bureaucratic, academic notions of what you need to do to be involved. Some people come and bring their resumes and just becomes this ridiculous, unnecessary, because colonialism, white supremacy, it kills indiscriminately in the Black community. And some people get it in different ways and other ones get it in other ways, but it don't matter what type of resume I have, what type of suit and tie I have, where I'm standing up, sitting down, my hands up, or I'm laying on the ground. People have died and been shot and killed and been hung up by trees for less. So we try to bring it all together in the best way that we can. And one I tend to save for the last is we are unapologetically Black. I love saying it because unapologetically Black. I don't care how you feel about me being unapologetically black. I just want to let you know that. I always do that. I love my skin. I love the cocoa butter I put on my skin. I love the black food that I eat, whether it's coming from or the Jamaican food, which I didn't know about till I got up here. I'm from Arkansas. It's amazing. It's everything. Or whether it's just having a conversation about black culture and having to tell people what being black is like. It's this thing that happens when you talk to white people and you say, yeah, black people, we do this. And their face kind of scrunches up a little bit, and it's just like, what is that and why is it happening? But because I'm unapologetically black, I'm going to continue to say that because I need you to know that we're not the same. Blackness is not an aberration of whiteness. It's not some type of castaway imitation or any other bullshit like that. So loving myself, loving my blackness means that I have to be able to take care of every part of it before I can do something for somebody else, do something for another group of people, another struggle. It doesn't mean that those people are not included in the efforts that we make, not at all. But it is a necessary prerequisite before I can do anything else to love myself. Otherwise, I will not survive. Too often in the black community, too often in black spaces, we treat it like the help, the servants. You know, we can share within the joys and the privileges of the master and not complain. You know, you just take it. It doesn't matter what you feel, doesn't matter what you think, doesn't matter what you know. You share my experience. So when I'm going out being unapologetically black and intentionally having these conversations where I'm saying to people, yeah, black people do this because I want you to know it ain't the same. And people will kind of respond like weirdly and oddly because you don't realize that you think that our stuff is similar or that we're imitating you, but within your response, I have to correct it. And in those moments, we begin to know each other better because we can know each other by the differences. For example, if I were to say, or if a woman was to say to me, yes, women have to deal with this, and I would like, it is weird look, and you'd be like, what is wrong with this dude? He's an asshole. You know, but when it comes to black issues, it seems like that it's accepted. It's accepted. It's an understood thing, and it's a thought. And what we have to find is not only a way to be able to have all these conversations together, but to think about it in a very intersectional way where we're not trying to understand somebody by way of what our academic definition has defined it, but they can tell us. You can just tell us, like, hey, this is my experience. So that's a big part of being unapologetically black. Also part of unapologetically black is meaning that I can live, laugh, love, and entertain, and everybody's okay with that, but I also can defend. I'm gonna go for my people all day, all the time, and I don't care how people feel about that. That's part of that. It's not having to censor yourself in any way, because that's always a thing that happens. So Black Lives Matter is a political and ideological intervention to the constant invalidation that happens at the hands of white supremacy, happens at the hands of state violence, happens at the hands of racism. So when I say to you, we're invalidated, what does that mean? I think what it means is when people say stuff like black on black crime, as if there's something unique about crime within black communities that isn't indicative of communities in which people share demographic identities altogether. For example, if we were talking like that, you're going to have Asian on Asian crime, you have white on white crime, you have all these different topics. But when we talk about something like black on black crime, you invalidate the fact that black communities, for one, were segregated intentionally. Black communities, for one, were deprived of economic advantages intentionally. Black communities, for one, were targeted by the criminal justice system. And all of those ways have had detrimental effects on the black community. So, but the only thing that we talk about is violence, because otherwise we have to look in the mirror and see about how things got this way. That's what I mean by invalidating. So what Black Lives Matter ends up having to do is having to give information. We got to inform people, say, this is what's going on, this is how it happened. Well, if you think about this particular city block, so many people have been targeted for stop and frisk over and over again. They don't have access to the same quality of schools because funding was cut. They don't have access to the same community intervention as other communities have. Funding was cut. All these things, we have to bring the narrative back. Bring the narrative back all the time. So with Black Lives Matter Boston, one of the things that we work on is alternative community structures, alternative community solutions. And we've always had them, you know, we've always been able to solve problems in whatever way we've needed to. I mean, a lot of us know what it's like to have your mom or your grandma wash your clothes in the sink because the washer and dryer was broke, or maybe you didn't have one. It's an alternative solution to, you know, a commonly understood problem. But when we're thinking about the way that communities operate, we have to solve our problems a lot of the time. So when alternative community structures, what does that mean? Why is it needed? Well, let me tell you. Let's look at something like Puerto Rico and what's happened lately at the aftermath of the hurricane and the lack of aid. I didn't know a lot about Puerto Rico in terms of that Puerto Rico was the path of colonization, and I want to say the Jones Act, and how they took over land and only allowed Puerto Ricans to be citizens right before World War II. I didn't know about any of this. I had to learn by way of other Puerto Rican folks. But if we're looking for the state and the government to be able to provide structure, be able to provide the things that people need after suffering from hurricanes, suddenly we see it's not there. So what do people have to do? They have to bound together, oftentimes by Puerto Rican folks that are in the state, and come up with alternative systems for taking care of themselves. Because when the system, when the state itself is racist, when the state itself operates in conjunction with white supremacy, then you cannot count on it to do for you. So you create these structures where you can build for yourself. And that's what's happened. We've seen a real life example of how alternative community structures, you see all these people flying out jets and planes for the people who have the opportunity to do so. The people who don't are sharing things on Facebook, different links, having donation centers, getting ready for them to come up over here. The state didn't do none of that. Those are the things that people had to do on their own. So when it comes to alternative structure, that means like things like me doing the radio show, being able to give news and talk about. It was a Marcus Osborne, a guy in Massachusetts, was killed in a hit and run by a white woman, and the state detective agencies didn't charge her with a crime. Went home, they knew who it was, and all this, and still having to fight for that. But now they come to us and say, hey, what's going on? Can you help? So we can uplift that, share the PayPal, we can share that story and share that narrative, because we can't count on the state. We can't count on the state-sanctioned media to provide that for us. We can't. It's just how things go. One thing that we've been working on is the Deeper Than Water campaign. It's about the Norfolk water prison crisis. So in 2011, the water in the pipes broke. I mean, not the water in the pipe, but the system broke down, and all the cells and bunks, they flooded, and they haven't fixed it since 2011. So this is within the prison. People have access to water that is tainted because it's been broken for a long time. It has high levels of sediment, high levels of manganese, which is unhealthy. But because they're in prison, people don't care. And the deadline for fixing it has been pushed back 3 times. And now we're looking at 6 years later. It still hasn't been fixed. And people on the outside are having to activate themselves to rally to get this thing done. This is the type of work Black Lives Matter picks up. So when we're counting on the state to say, hey, can you do this? Can you take care of these people? It's not happening. This is why we have to do this. So, and also, before I forget, we're teaming up with Sociedad Latina in Boston on Friday and Saturday for people to bring donations for Puerto Rico. There's an event up on Facebook, and they also have times on their website for when they're taking donations. Make sure you get involved in that. But this is the work that we do. So let me explain a little bit how racism works. You have the individual, structural, and institutional. This is just a little bit please educate yourself at home, but I'm just going to give you an example of how these things work. So with the individual, people, and I'm going to tell you when I come out to these things, people focus on the individual intervention. And I'm going to tell you why that's a problem. So with the individual intervention, you're looking at people like Donald Trump and saying, okay, he's saying racist, problematic stuff. Somebody should go have a conversation with him and educate him about what's going on. Somebody needs to talk to this guy, because that solves the problem. But what we don't look into is the institutional policies that he has instituted since he's been there. We don't look at some of the more statewide and national plans that he's looking to push forward, because that requires work. It requires organizing with people who have been similarly affected. Sometimes people focus on the individual piece and be like, oh yeah, that person, yeah, we need to say something to them. But when you got a racist teacher and they have the dominion over 40 or 50 students, and you're just trying to have little interventions, it's time to step it up. You make sure you let them know, but then you move up to the next rank. What are the checks and balances do we have to make sure that this can't operate on an institutional level? And if it's a state law that allows a state to employ somebody who engages in racist stuff, or allows people to discriminate based on religion or sexual orientation, I don't know if some of y'all know what I'm making reference to, but I hope you do. Look it up at home. You should be fighting for that, instead of waiting for the opportunity to just individually approach somebody, which that work is important, but sometimes that's not the end, because people have power and reach, and it goes to different places. So with something like this, instead of focusing on this individual narrative, what we do in Black Lives Matter, we take it to a structural, take it to the institutional one. Okay, well, let's build an alternative system. I can't trust you to provide for me. I can't trust you to be safe to my people. What are some ways that we can deal with people in our communities where we don't have to interact with the police? How do we do that? Can't trust you to be safe. All these laws that came in the 80s, war on drugs, let them do whatever the they want to do. They can take the money out of your pocket, steal it, put it in the police department, take it back. You know how many people lost their phones? They're gone. You won't ever get them again because somebody took it home. This is how these systems work, and people watch it happen. So instead of sitting here having to fight with different folks over here and over here, we say, okay, well, how do we take care of us so we do not have to be a part of that? And that's what it's like. That's what it's like. And when you have an abolitionist approach, which means that you don't believe in prisons, that means that you have to take on that problem yourself. Everybody has a shared responsibility. And as much as we talk about how problematic something can be, when you start saying, like, you know what, the community is responsible now, people start backing up. Like, you know what, I think sometimes it's okay for people to come up and shoot people if I got a problem with it. People start to take a step back. But with the community, I don't believe it is a natural or appropriate solution for an armed person to come into a dispute between me and one other person. You steal something, I'm gonna invite a person with a gun to handle it. How do we feel about violence? Is it problematic only when certain people have guns? Or is it always an issue? You have to evaluate those things, because what that also means is that when people are having problems, for one, domestic violence was an issue that happens in every community. That means that the community takes on those things. So Black Lives Matter being oriented toward alternative community solutions, then we have to figure out ways to work the community. How do we stop Fred from beating his wife? How do we intervene in that? If we're saying that the police state, the system is dehumanizing, what do you do to take care of that? It's hard work. People don't want to do it. So that's where Black Lives Matter comes in. A very different formation about how you take care of these problems. How do you take care and sustain Black people in a mental health system that is not designed for us? Those projects were having, rich white men and some white women dealing with people who had the capital to come in and see them for 7-10 years on a row and write a book about it. It's cool. It's good books. I've read them. But some of those things don't work well for our community, and we have to come up with ways to be able to sustain ourselves. So that's just like the what is it called? Quick and fast. Is that how you say it? Quick and fast explanation of Black Lives Matter. So we're gonna do some questions and answers. So yeah.
Just so the audience knows, we have 2 mics at the end of each aisle because we're filming the talk tonight for WCAT, and they will be cable casting and putting on their YouTube channel both talks simultaneously, as opposed to 1 2 weeks ago and this one. So if anyone has any questions, please come up to one of the mics so we can get you on the... Just go ahead to the mic. It's not town meeting.
I saw this Black Lives meeting in the Wakefield item just by chance, and I do think it is an important subject. With that, I would like to ask the gentleman, I have to ask this question. What is your opinion of Colin Kaepernick and how the situation has blown out of proportion when he was doing something that he chose to do, a demonstration, a behavior, and it's just gone out of context now, you know, with Trump, as you said, and the media and the military. I can't believe the military even thinks they take it personally. And I'm sure when Colin kneeled down at those football games, that he never thought it would go this far. And I'd just like to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think Colin Kaepernick was him doing that act was exactly the type of activism that you want. It's something very simple, very easy to replicate, and it starts the conversation. And it didn't hurt nobody, thankfully. A lot of times when you talk about social change is violent, and this is something he did by kneeling down. I think the response and the subsequent conflation of terms and mixing one meaning with another, it just shows the level of racism that we have. Oftentimes, white people, as it relates to black people, particularly black people who entertain, will become very upset because they're not doing it the right way. They'll cite some type of formality, some type of norm. And then people say, well, you shouldn't protest by kneeling down. You can't protest here, you can't protest there. Like what? And he literally knelt down. He didn't pull out knives out of his pocket and start throwing them at the goalposts. He just sat there and just did his thing. And then he did it for a while before people even noticed. It's not like he ran in the middle of the field and just like plopped down and they said like, look, I got something to say, and just knelt down. This didn't happen. He just did his thing. He explained why, and people get upset. When I talk about being unapologetically black, what the want is that we contain our response to the way that the world treats us. I'm just supposed to just roll with it. And that's what I hear when people get really angry about it and say, well, it's disrespectful to this, it's disrespectful to that. Well, solve the problem. He's just kneeling down. If it's such an issue, why don't you investigate it? Why don't you have like some open forum? And the NFL, I think they just did something recently, donate money to some type of police reform. But it took that long. You know, so I would say it's accomplished. I think it's cool.
I think part of the problem is that what has gotten lost in the furor over the last few weeks is this is a demonstration of the particularly American way of trying to bring problems to the public. It's called the First Amendment, and it was done nonviolently. It was done in a way that he said something simple, and you're right, the politics and the inherent racism behind some of the politics has conflated it now to this huge, crisis thing that is involving people in ways that it was never meant to be and shouldn't. And ultimately, the point of it is being lost.
And I do want to make a shout out to the youth, because football is only in season for so long. And all these other sports that have been going on past the football season after Kaepernick finished his stuff, it's been youth who've been kneeling down and keeping the conversation going. And, since the furor and the issues with Trump, people have been saying it's related to this or related to that. But the co-optation of movement, symbolism has been a thing that's happened for a long time, and it continue to happen, and it forces a narrative and it forces a conversation. One part of not just like a colonial framework, but an oppressive dynamic is telling you that there's never a right time to talk about something. And we see that in some of the responses to the Harvey Weinstein stuff. A lot of men out there say, well, you knew what it was, you knew why don't you keep it to yourself because you signed up for this or you signed up for that. That type of behavior is not just problematic in those situations, and I would say violent. It's the same for other groups and other people when we try to silence people when they have something that they have to say. And there's a lot of other ways that people could go about protesting police violence, and that was probably the safest one.
And the most in keeping with trying to get the point across quietly, non-violently. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a follow-up question to the Kaepernick situation. What do you say to critics of him that say that the NFL is his workplace and he's there to work, and therefore the First Amendment kind of protections don't really apply there? He's free to do that on his own time, but not during work. And what do you say to the advertisers and the stadium owners and everything, because their ratings are way down, their attendance is way down? Are they supposed to essentially pay for this protest?
Well, their ratings have been down, for one. Also, back when, I want to say it was a Jets fan, it was maybe 10 years ago, took the Patriots to court because he said they were cheating. There was a court decision that said the NFL is entertainment. So, are you not entertained is what I would say to the critics, because people got something to talk about on Sunday night if it's not about how bad the Giants are. You know, it's always something that's rolling there. If you get critic, you say, well, you do this at work. What about the NFL and this problem with domestic violence? People have been abusing their wives and partners and spouses for so long, and the NFL is okay with it. And all these same people who got a problem with Kaepernick have been okay with it. You know, they've been okay with the fact that these guys have CTE, and by the time they're 50 and 60, they can't talk, walk, or take care of themselves. They've been okay with it. So when this guy kneels down, no violence toward anyone in protest of violence toward other people, particularly a group that he's in, people have that criticism, I would say, that is contradictory.
You know, from a historical point of view, this is not the first time this sort of demonstration has been seen. There were the two black athletes in the Olympics back in, I think it was 68, who did the Black Power symbol as they were on the first and second tiers getting their awards. I think, again, the point that's being missed is having the conversation, finding a way to solve the problem. All of this other stuff is noise to distract. And whether it's about race or whether it's about gender or whether it's about men abusing women, the ultimate outcome is the same, that it gets lost in the noise. Anyone else?
Thank you for coming. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or tips to talk to people who respond with All Lives Matter. Yep. I'm curious about suggestions or tips you would have for talking to people who say All Lives Matter in response to Black Lives Matter.
Can I have a volunteer from the crowd? How are you? What's your name?
EJ.
EJ. EJ, you're important. I want you to know that. It's not a joke, no gag. You're important. Sure, you're a nice person. I care about you. EJ, does that mean that Ed is not important?
Absolutely not.
Does that mean that Ed doesn't matter?
Absolutely not.
So I can say that EJ is important, and Ed can still be important at the same time.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's more like, I think a lot of white folk miss that it's Black Lives Matter, comma, too, and not Black Lives Matter only. I think that's the problem that most people have with the, when they say it out loud. They don't hear that. It's an inclusion thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're not pushing people away because it's just Black Lives Matter. I think that's
Yeah.
the main thing, yeah.
And it's something that they add,
Exactly.
you know.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Seems like intersectionality is the buzzword of the day. Could you expound on that word a little bit?
Well, I talk about intersectionality a lot, and I had to talk about my journey with intersectionality. Basically, in layman's term, a very simple definition, that it is the idea that we have different identities that cross and overlap and intersect in various ways that changes one person's experience from somebody else's. So for me, me being a black cisgender male with a certain level of like economic advantage, I have a car. I have a different experience. I went to school, graduated, have a different experience than somebody who did not do that, who has, let's say, a black trans woman would have, who went to school and has a car, certain economic advantage. They're very different experiences and a lot of hardships that I don't experience. So that's, when you think about intersectionality, you have to be able to understand that somebody's identity is different from yours. And another thing is it's not for you to determine for them what that is and how that affects them. My journey with intersectionality was, I try to tell this when I go out, is I thought it was stupid, to be honest. And the first time I heard it, I was like, what? That's dumb. And I thought it was just one of these kind of like neoliberal topics or coming from academia that was just hyper intellectualized. And what changed my mind is I have a lot of my close friends are women, and something would come up, and I was like, oh, I haven't seen that. They were like, that's because you're a man, Martin. And I'm like, okay, I guess maybe I should think different. And I would just being with them and them trusting me and just talking candidly about their experiences, it just made me think, oh man, there's a whole nother way of being. There's a whole nother way of thinking about stuff that I don't even have to deal with. Another time is one of my other friends. It was a conversation. We were just talking about dating, and I was saying something stupid like, I think it'd be cool to be a woman because I can get free meals when people take me out on dates. And she was like, yeah, there's this thing though when guys ask them out where you can't never really just say no because of that fear of violence. And I was like, whoa, wow, like I'd never experienced that feeling of not being able to like turn somebody down. And so that really made me have to think deeply about intersectionality and what people's different experiences put them in line for, and then being able to have conversation and have questions and understand some of the advantages that I have that they don't always experience. Just like going into a room and having a meeting and men talking over women. And there's just a common thing that happens. And I had to realize, oh, and the thing that when you go into spaces where people look to you to speak first is something that I had to understand. So with the intersectional framework and knowing that people have a lot of hardships, particularly as it relates to Black Lives Matter, that we center queer and trans people because a lot of these intersectional pressures are so heightened that we have to take care of the most marginalized in our community. So yeah, that's kind of my journey with intersectionality.
Anyone else? Just come on down to the mic.
So I want to thank you for coming and opening up dialogue, because I think that is sorely missing, dialogue between humans. So I'm often in a place where I'm looking at moving between worlds, and whether that be, the intersectionality aspect of our person, different professions, different SES levels, different races, different, family structures, whatever it be. So sometimes I find it super challenging And I'm wondering what it's like for you to move through many different worlds.
Well, I'm not like everybody else. I kind of move toward challenges, and this is unnatural, and I've had to accept that. So I sometimes put myself in these difficult situations where I have to figure things out. And I'll kind of meditate and perseverate on something until I have a good understanding of it. So it's difficult in the beginning. And I think what I tend to do is with intersectionality and patriarchy and having to understand what these things meant, I had to start reading it up on my own. And then just like if a teacher were to give you homework, then I'll come back to people who would kind of introduce me to it, and I'll ask them questions like, oh, is this that? Which goes a lot further than just asking out of the blue, because then it becomes this expectation that people are just supposed to explain everything about their world and experience, which can be exhausting and taxing for some folks. Some folks are willing, but that sometimes can be an effect that happens. I think I've just had to educate myself and try to take the burden off of whatever group I'm trying to understand. And before I come to them and say, hey, what is this like, or what is that? And sometimes when I do get to the point where I'm having conversations, I just kind of give a disclaimer, say, hey, I think this, but maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. So I open it up to say I'm completely ignorant about it, and then that sometimes helps with having dialogue and conversation, and people kind of respect that.
So recently there's been some removal of Confederate statues and other things that are symbols of slavery. And I want to know how you feel about the removal of those statues and the Confederate flag and things like that, because they're symbols of slavery. And then sort of extend upon that in terms of Mount Rushmore or the White House that was built by slaves. Where does the removal of these slavery monuments, where does it end?
It doesn't end. You don't go to Europe or Germany and see monuments of Hitler anywhere, because people are ashamed of it. It is a stain upon their history, but at the same time, they make sure they remember it. So remembrance and acknowledgement of history does not equate keeping Confederate statues. And what the Confederates will often say is that, oh, you're removing our history. But the thing is, we want to make sure we don't forget it. But we don't have to celebrate the people who killed black folks and advocated for their continued enslavement, even though we know that the war was fought to preserve the Union and not for the freedom of the slaves. So you remove those monuments to show, for one, reverement for the folks who died for that. And you also, the South lost. They lost. They're sore losers. Give it up. We don't need any more monuments. It was over. You fought and killed half the country, or tried to, and then want monuments to be erected in your celebration. I think that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. But on to my first point is that we have to remember that history without celebrating the people who committed those atrocities. I don't know any place where there's been genocidal actions that happen where they have monuments to great leaders who were on the other side. It just doesn't make sense. Only in America. And part of that happens from colonialization, where to appease the South, they allowed them to erect these monuments. We shouldn't be trying to appease the South anymore. It doesn't make any sense. They're part of the Union now, even though some people have forgotten. That's over and it's done. So you get rid of that. And what you do is you erect monuments of the people that they tried to continue to enslave. Put some Harriet Tubman stuff up there. Prince, I like Prince. Put a Prince monument. Erykah Badu is also a good person. Beyonce, she's still alive. And so, there's other ways to acknowledge history. That way is just rooted in a lot of racism. Well, they're Confederate generals that they're monuments toward. Just like they have a monument toward Christopher Columbus, who enslaved, who It's a whole thing. But one thing that Christopher Columbus did was introduce encomiendas, which is a form of seasoning slaves and get them ready to be sold, and beating the culture and all of these things out of them. You get rid of the generals for say those particular people, but the work that have been done by slaves in this country is part of the history, and you teach that history. You don't celebrate the people who fought to continue to keep them enslaved. That's where you draw the line at, right there.
The history we cannot change, but you have to remember that a lot of those Confederate statues were put up in the late 19th, early 20th century, long after the war. And they were put up in the South in particular, not with the intention of honoring those people, but scaring the hell out of other people. And, you know, the one thing that I remember, and I'm going to take a minute here for this, probably everyone here knows who Shelby Foote was. Anyone who's seen Ken Burns' The Civil War knows who Shelby Foote was. And he often said over the years, and I've got a most complete copy of it here, the institution of slavery is a stain on this nation's soul that will never be cleansed. It is just as wrong can be, a huge sin, and it is on our soul. There's a second sin that's almost as great, and that's emancipation. They told 4,500,000 people, you are free, hit the road. And we're still suffering from that. 3/4 of them couldn't read or write. Not 1/10 of them had a profession except for farming. And yet they were turned loose and told, go your way. In 1877, the last Union troops were withdrawn after a dozen years of being in the South to assure compliance with the law. Once they were withdrawn, all the Jim Crow laws and everything else came down on the blacks. Their schools were inferior in every sense. They had the Freedmen's Bureau, which did perhaps some good work, but it was mostly a joke, corrupt in all kinds of ways. So they had no help. Just turned loose on the world, and they were waifs. It's a very sad thing. There should have been a huge program for schools. There should have been all kinds of employment provided for them. Not modern welfare. You can't expect that in the middle of the 19th century. But there should have been some earnest effort to prepare these people for citizenship. They were not prepared and operated under horrible disadvantages once the Army was withdrawn, and some of the consequences are very much with us today. You have to remember that the Army was withdrawn because of the Compromise of 1877, which allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. And that started the whole thing in the South that continued until 1964, and in a lot of ways still continues today.
Hi, I want to thank you, and especially for educating us. But what I want to know, what can we do to make it better? Where can we donate? I know the best thing we can do is try to educate everybody, but what would your recommendations be?
Well, the Movement for Black Lives is a platform that many black organizations signed on to that really outlines the goals of the black community. Came forward with this platform that's very clear. And there's tons of organizations that do tons of work. I would suggest reading into it and figuring out one to plug into. The next thing that we have going on is working with Sociedad Latina in Boston, and we're going to be doing a donation drive Friday. I want to say from 11 to 3, and Saturday from like 11 to 2 or something like that for stuff for Puerto Rico. But as it relates to kind of the question of what we can do, I mean, you have to kind of really, for one, I would say educate yourself about what colonization is, about, it's even kind of a step back further than what racism is. And then you kind of learn the ways in which colonized people are treated in order to make room for the people who have colonized them. America is a colony of Great Britain and shipped in black folks and killed off a lot of the indigenous folks. And so understanding that process, I think historically helps you understand some of the interpersonal norms that happen. Just even now, the thing that happened, white people still expect you to move out the way on the sidewalk. But what people don't realize is the legacy of that is that when black people were, years and years ago, had to look down or walk in the gutter when white folks did that. So we're still, it's 2017, and people still have that practice, but don't have the knowledge of where it comes from. So what I would say is definitely educate yourself on some of these Jim Crow laws and the black codes and the Reconstruction, and it kind of gives you the picture of some of the main ills that happen within the community, and really will prepare you to jump in whatever work that you decide to do. Sometimes it's just running a community pantry, sometimes it's just volunteering, but sometimes I think it's helpful to know, because that knowledge of knowing all these things happen helps you distribute it to somebody else. Like those laws, we still have remnants of, we had those laws that if black folks were, too many black folks was in one area at a time, you can get arrested. But you still see that if you congregate in a certain area, police will come down and start to stop and frisk you and ask you all these questions, and like, aren't you doing, like, some of the same things are happening, but because people don't have that data. And that's what I would do is I would say educate yourself, and then step into kind of understanding something like the platform for Black Lives, and understand, because it outlines everything. It outlines some policy distinctions. It outlines what the war on black people is. It outlines a whole lot of stuff. Ending mass incarceration, some goals and things that people can do. So learning the history and then looking into that, I think, would be really helpful.
Thank you. Anyone else?
If you look around a lot of towns in the Boston area, Wakefield included, there's not a whole lot of diversity. I mean, you can go through, days, weeks, a lifetime without ever really interacting with anybody different than yourself. From sort of a Black Lives Matters perspective, from my perspective, I think that's a big part of the problem. There's just, unless you have interaction, everybody who's different than you is always going to be sort of other. Is there any sort of thought within Black Lives Matters as to where that sort of segregation, lack of diversity plays into it all, and how to, begin making, strides towards a more diverse environment?
Well, I think for one, you got to start with like a culturally diverse environment first. So if we come with the assumption that all of our spaces have to be catered to white men, and then in every way, and things that white men like to do culturally, and the kind of the norms that comes with that, the people who want to feel comfortable there are white men. When you start to open up things a little culturally, being able to do things like acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day, being able to change the practice within the institutions, that it's not situated in this very Western framework, you find that people will be comfortable with it. I've been in places that I knew when I walked in there, this ain't for me. You can just tell about just the mood, the vibe, exactly what's going on. Look, I shouldn't be here because they got a certain thing going on. And being very thoughtful about what that is and what those cultural norms are that make people welcome, make people feel welcome, can be one of the things that helps with changing the process. Because they're isolated communities, but people of color come in contact with them, and they move on if they feel that they're not safe. So one of those things that you can do is finding ways to make sure they're safe, finding like multicultural groups or whatever church, school, or job institution that you have to make sure it's culturally competent or culturally aware in a way that people are not being harmed from it. I think that's always helpful, because if we think of diversity just from a pure physical point where we just have different bodies that look different in one spot, then that's not really diverse. It has to be diverse the whole way through. Like when we're talking about movies, if somebody says you see the people on the screen and you say, wow, that's a really diverse movie, but what did the casting director look like? What was the producer? look like? What did the cinematographer look like? The set designer? If it's all white folks in the back, then you just end up doing like a minstrel show. Like, because somebody is deciding what these views of people of color should look like that don't look like them. But you have to have it all the way through. And I think just finding ways to make those things comfortable and having those conversations is the way that you start. Because you don't want to get caught in the trap of like, well, we can't move people out here and make it more diverse. You got to think about other ways in which you can bring about diversity, and then the bodies will come.
Okay, anyone else? This is great.
I want to join the many in thanking you. I'm curious what you do with your anger.
This.
The question is, what do you do with your anger?
Yeah, this is what I do with my anger. I pour it into something. Otherwise, I'll just be eaten alive. And doing this activist work is what sustains me, because feeling as though you can't do anything is kind of one of those, like, the sunken place. It absorbs all of yourself, because I can't change what I see, but I can be active in what I do. So I just stay moving.
At the mic, please. At the mic, please, so we can pick it up.
I just have one quick thing to say, which relates to what you said about intervening and mixing and all diversity. I work in the theater in Boston, the Opera House, and we just finished with Phantom of the Opera. For the first time, Phantom was black. And it was amazing because he was kind. He came up to us, the low ushers, before the show started and said to us, well, I welcome all of you and I appreciate you being here. And that's never happened before with anybody on the stage. So that was a very nice gesture. The other thing, this black Phantom happened to be the best that we've ever had. And the only way we could tell he was black was you could see his hands because his face was all covered. But he was a wonderful person. And this is the, what's the word you used, mixing? You said something like that. What was it? Intersection?
Intersectional.
Yeah, and as you said, the jobs, housing, it starts everywhere. It just doesn't start up here. And that was one way I thought was great to blend the races. Thank you.
I have a question. Who would you suggest to follow on social media like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram?
Well, I mean, Black Lives Matter Boston, our Facebook, you follow that, we always post stuff. Also, Deeper Than Water has a Facebook page. The coalition I talked about for the Norfolk prison water crisis has that. I follow a lot of people. My Twitter following habits, everybody wouldn't prescribe to, because I follow everybody, even the people who say nonsense, because I just want to know what everybody's saying. But I think, for one, Twitter, how people knew about Mike Brown and Ferguson was Twitter. That's how it came to light. It wasn't anything else. And so I look at that when I'm trying to figure out what the news is. Sometimes I go to Twitter and I follow all these random people, and they'll like put out all this information. I don't know. I don't have like one source of people to do it. But in terms of Facebook, definitely follow us. And you got BLM Cambridge that's doing stuff. You have a couple of different organizations that do work across Boston. I'm trying to, them names I forget now. Or the Movement for Black Lives. A lot of those groups within that signed on have different Facebook and Twitter pages. But I advocate, just follow as many people as you can who have information, so you know.
And is your radio show also accessible on the internet, like via podcasting?
Oh yeah. So glad you brought it up. I didn't even mention
Boy, if that wasn't a pitch.
So yeah, BLM Boston has this radio show we do. It comes on InsightRadioApp.com. every Thursday at 7. And it also is streamed on YouTube at the same time on the page is called Insight Radio. And we don't have any recorded episodes yet. It's all live right now, but definitely check it out when you get a chance. And I don't know when we're going to get to the point where we can start recording them, but we're working on it.
So there's no way to hear any of the older programs?
Not that I'm aware of, because the guy who does the audio engineer stuff, it has some like technical difficulties with being able to re-upload it, and yeah, it's a lot of stuff I know nothing about. But I'll just keep asking. But as of right now, no. But when we do get some of the old stuff up, I'll post it on the BLM Boston's Facebook page, so people can have access to it.
Fantastic. Anything else?
Hi, thank you for coming. My knowledge of Black Lives Matter was really as a result of the police brutality. So it was very helpful to me to hear what you had to say tonight. It's become more of a social movement and what you're doing. My question to you is, I've heard the police commissioner, the Boston Police Commissioner on the radio sometimes talking about what they've tried to do and the improvements they've tried to make. And I thought I would ask you, what have you seen change or not change in Boston and the cities around Massachusetts? And my second question is, have you seen any improvement in hiring for black men, for blacks in police or fire or other departments?
Well, there are no good cops, and I'm going to explain why. Because the essential understanding of policing is predicated on basically capitalism. It means that you have to keep the lowest portion of society who have the most to gain in a particular place, and it's often situated by property and the management of property. Police, as they existed within this country, have had a direct relationship with that, particularly the prison industrial complex. Also thinking of some of the first police officers being slave catchers. The role hasn't changed because you can still enslave people, because by way of the 13th Amendment, if you've been convicted of a crime, you're enslaved. And you can go into prison and you work for free. So with policing, my interest is not to make better police or to reform the department. My interest is to get rid of the police. The police serve a function. My experience is that you bring armed white men into a room to solve any sort of problem that can be dealt with by the community. What I've seen is that when you start talking about holding police accountable, when you start talking about Black Lives Matter, I haven't seen one police officer say Black Lives Matter ever. Because somehow it's seen as an affront to them. So this accountability and this need for community justice and peace somehow is no longer relevant when we start holding police in this particular position. Hasn't been that framing. But what I have seen is that the overabundance of power, what I have seen is that the connection between the police and white supremacists, as we've seen that white supremacist groups have infiltrated the police and have intentionally done so to that and other intelligence agencies. And what I see is how the police as an institution often undermine the efforts of the community to perform in a way that's autonomous of them, for somebody who doesn't want violence to be so prevalent. For all the concerns that happen, the police seem to be most concerned with maintaining the police. That's what I see. So my interest is not in having more black cops, because you change the face of the person in control. The system has still been created to maintain order by way of white supremacy. That origin still remains the same. So even if it's something as high as being the president of the U.S., it still is a Western colonizing nation. It doesn't stop being that because you got a black president, and it doesn't stop being something that's harmful and targeted towards the black community because you got black cops. Oftentimes, black cops, in some situations, are more brutal because they want to ensure that they maintain their place within the police department, and they want to show that they're not impartial. Because so they show white supremacy even though they're black. It works in that way. So I'm not looking for seeing better police officers. I'm not looking to see an improvement. I'm not looking to see them in more places. What I am looking to see is that they get out of our schools. What I am looking to see is that we have restorative justice practices and policies instead of bringing in resource officers who come in and arrest kids for doing all sorts of things that could be solved in other ways. We've become a nation that sees violence as an answer to everything. It's not just violence when black communities engage in it, and it's not just violence when we're talking about the football field. We're talking about violence when somebody is congregating, kids are hanging out on the block. You can call an armed man to come move them. That's the type of thing that comes with talking about the police. When I talk about community solutions, because I don't even try to think about what the police are doing and what they're not doing in terms, unless I'm talking about the type of money that's spent on police overtime, which is a whole lot. But I'm trying to think about what are some ways that we can make sure our community stays safe without having to invite chains and guns to the party. How do we do that? So that's where my mind is. So I'm not worried about black cops.
Well, thank you. It's going to be difficult to follow up after that answer. Wow. He wants to get rid of the police and capitalism, but I'll go on with my question. Donald Trump is often described in the media as a racist and a bigot. I know he said things that are controversial about Muslims and certainly illegal immigrants, but I'm really interested in what he said specifically about the black community that was racist or what he has done. I know decades ago he actually won a civil rights award that was very prestigious. And I just want to know specifically what he has said or done to the black community that is racist.
He said, "What do you have to lose?" That's what he said. That's the most recent thing that I remember Donald Trump doing, particularly towards the black community. We were talking about, he went to a rally, supposedly speaking to black people. He'll never show what audience he's talking to because it probably ain't a whole lot of us out there. But he said, "What do you have to lose?" Like, what type of insult is that, saying that you have, your situation is so dire that, just vote me in, because you have nothing to gain. What do you have to lose? We have everything to gain. What do you have to lose? Donald Trump, with all the comments that people have about Donald Trump, I think is so interesting. And I think a lot of people have talked about the parallel between him and Harvey Weinstein, and the same amount of or similar sexual misconduct allegations have been made, and nobody's worried about it like that. It's not even, everybody's up in arms about this guy, but when we start talking about political power and how it distributes itself across our nation, and the person who is doing it has also had these same problems, it's not as much of a concern. I think white supremacy sacrifices members of the white community in order to maintain power. And I think you see that with Donald Trump and some of the things that he does. It's like, oh yeah, we can forgive it. It doesn't matter if he did this toward women, because, white people are still getting this type of, white supremacists particularly getting this type of pass on things. But even if he hadn't said anything about black people, all the racist comments and smug remarks, I still feel as a black activist in my community, I think it's my duty to fight for freedom, not just for my own, but for that of other people. So for him to say all these things about immigrant and undocumented folks, for one, those immigrant and undocumented folks are black too. For him to make these comments about women, for one, those women are black too. Thinking about intersectionality, and for Mexican folks, those Mexican folks are black too. There's some out there, and people don't know that, there's Mexican black folks. But thinking about intersectionality is that, for one, we're present in all of these groups, and a lot of times we're understood as like one identity, one conglomerate. We're like the last to be acknowledged. We got to fight for every sense of space that we get. And as it pertains to Donald Trump, that fight isn't just limited to the stuff that affects us. We got to fight for everybody. We got to make sure that the people who are, particularly people of color, and marginalized folks are not getting the same treatment that we are. Because Carter G. Woodson talked about that in The Miseducation of the Negro, that is our duty to kind of fight to make sure that this, basically, I'm paraphrasing, that this system is not pushed out internationally into other groups. So whether or not Donald Trump has said anything about us or not, which he did, it's still our duty to fight for freedom and make sure that nobody has to deal with the type of stuff that we've had to deal with.
Ultimately, no one is free unless everyone is free. Anyone else?
Yes, I want to talk about restorative justice with you. So education is, in my little world anyway, of utmost importance. And I think that it's really easy for people to get reactive when you start talking about like dismantling systems, because that invokes fear. And then when people are fearful, they get really stupid because they go into their amygdala, and then the prefrontal cortex is no longer problem solving, right? So just for the public and for your platform, I would love you to talk more in terms of how you see education informing the restorative justice process and going forward into, you know, hopefully a more beautiful future, what that might look like from your perspective.
Absolutely. First of all, we got to stop taking money out of education. It just makes it so difficult to be able to have resources that children need when we're taking money out of education and putting it into things like resource officers, or putting police units in the schools and metal detectors. It's just so many things are pointed in the wrong direction, and it's hard to do that. So restorative justice is a manner of that is not punitive when there is an issue at hand, and it kind of restores this person's ability to be able to function and operate within the community, oftentimes by doing some type of work to stay integrated. And before we talk about it in education, we have to talk about it within our communities. So restorative justice means, like, when you have that uncle who is an and nobody wants to deal with them, and they did some error that they did, and they've been excommunicated, and that you try to find a way to restore that connection without just cutting things off. One thing about the way in which our community operates, is particularly Western thought and practice, is that we treat our connections as if they're inorganic. Like they're not, we're not all tied by this weave of consciousness and experience on the earth. And we have to treat each other as if removing somebody from our world also harms us too. So when we think about it in our personal spaces, finding ways to be accountable and holding your communities together. We know that about like certain cultural and ethnic groups, very close knit, a lot of times they have to be. But in some spaces, like, people deal with it, if something happens, they deal with it. You don't even know about it. And I think when it comes to education, when we use these prison-related solutions to problems, we're depriving people of the opportunity to learn, because they haven't fit whatever model it is that we have given to everybody for how they're supposed to be within the classroom environment. Thankfully, we have some vocational schools, but every school can't keep people engaged, or they don't have the resources, or they haven't placed those resources into that type of thing. So when you're thinking about restorative justice and education, a basic solution, if you're taking somebody out of a classroom because they're acting up, you're not sending the resource officer to come get them. You're sending them to maybe like a quiet room. You're sending them to maybe the social worker's office. You're sending them to, you're checking with if they do have a therapist, or if they do have made a plan, checking with their plan and see what are the things that help them or calm them down, that don't have to remove them from this opportunity, and working with them to kind of restore what harm did they do to this community? How can they help this class function and give back? Or maybe that means picking up trash after the class is over. Maybe that means making an apology to the class. Maybe that means doing something a little bit different. You're basically not cutting people off from that connection. And we're used to cutting people off and separating and segregating them. We have a legacy of that. And I think for our children, if we're going to create something differently, we have to start with them, because they're going to grow up and be the adults that we are, and start trying to solve problems in a different way. Because you don't want a kid to learn how to call the police from their teacher, because the teacher calls the officer in there to come get a kid who was just talking too much. Because when they get older, that's going to be that person who's calling the police on the kids that are sitting outside or standing on the grass. You learn that punitive punishment model of intervening with problems that you don't want to deal with. So I think that those are some of the ways that you deal with it in the educational environment. And there's been models put out there. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but I think that's something that we definitely have to do more of.
Last question.
Okay. Just a couple of points here. Just bear with me. You said that there's no such thing as a good cop, and I just want to let you know, I was a police officer for 20 years, and I agree with you. I was a school teacher, left the school department because more opportunity in the police department, went back to school, got a master's degree, and I was going to bring some progressive thought to a police department. I was ostracized by bringing those progressive thoughts to the police department. That's my background. The other point I wanted to make was, you were talking about how the community has to resolve their problems rather than relying on the police. And anecdotes are the best way to point that out. The anecdote I wanted to relate to everybody here was, I believe it was in Boston, a black woman having trouble with a mentally ill son. She went to the social worker, she went to the hospitals, and they got a pink slip from her. The ambulance went down to serve the pink slip, and they left the police outside to keep the peace in case they needed them. You know the incident?
Well, that's not
okay, fairly common. Anyways, the ambulance, the two attendants of the ambulance were inside. They were going to escort them outside, and where the police were, scuffle began, and next thing you know, the police went in, shot and killed them. And so the woman asked the question, saying, why should I call the police? Goes right along with your point, like that, saying, this was not the resolution that I anticipated. Those anecdotes happen every day, and so I can really relate to that. But the final point that I really wanted to make here was, somebody asked earlier about the Colin Kaepernick situation. And then somebody else was asking the question about what has Donald Trump done relating to race? And so here's my answer. The point was that if you're an employee, national football player, and you're not obeying the rules, fire that guy. Get that SOB off the field, as Donald Trump said. And so people ask me, I'm an attorney. I left the police force and I went to law school and I became a criminal defense attorney, finding justice on the other side. So people ask me, said, well, First Amendment, tell me about the First Amendment. Well, the First Amendment it relates to the government suppressing free speech. So when I said that if you're the owner of a football team and that your player you have every right in the world to say, no, do not take a knee, you're going to obey these rules, you're going to stand at attention. That's perfectly all right within the First Amendment. However, when it comes to Donald Trump, and this is my response was, what did Donald Trump do against the blacks? Well, Donald Trump is the one saying that, as president, I'm saying, we should look into some of the tax benefits the NFL has. So what he's doing as government, his government position, that's a violation of the oath of office that you took. When you raised your hand as president and you said you would abide by the Constitution, you violated that when you said, I'm going to punish that person, and I'm recommending people to punish that person for exercising his free speech. And I've not heard anybody talk about that. I think that's an impeachable offense.
Right, one of many. So here's the side note about, so I do mental health, and I'm a counselor. And the mom said that why do the police have to come? The thing about how the system works is that in order to be able to get those psychiatric services and have the ambulance come, you have to call the police department. There's no other way to get it. And I've been in a situation where like, how do I get these things? That's the only way to get it. And you just have to sit there and hope that nothing bad happens. while managing what my my own reactions to people with guns being around me. And there's such a catch-22. In order to get these services, I have to invite this person that might kill them or respond violently because they don't have no training as it relates to these dealing with psychiatric situations. That's what it's like. So when I talk about no police, that's one of the interventions that happens. Police also were unionized to get certain duties, so they can put that within their job description. Nothing pisses me off more than seeing police directing traffic. It gets on my nerves. I think it's ridiculous. But I know how unions work, and I know that they lobby for the right to be able to do that. Right? That's what it is. So we have to be able to dismantle and pick these things apart, because the way that the mental health system is, you have to invite them into your space to be able to get your person taken care of. And every time that happens, I'm afraid, because there's nothing that I can do, and it's the only way to get that help.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this evening's talk. Let us once again thank Martin Henson. The speaker series will be back around this time next year, 2018. We're interested in your ideas for subjects or speakers. Please feel free to contact the Human Rights Commission or the UU Social Action Committee through our respective websites or Facebook pages. Please join us for refreshments just outside the hall and continue the conversation that has begun here. And this has, I must say, been quite a conversation. But remember that only through the dissemination of ideas and open interaction of all of us will we be able to find solutions to the daunting problems that face us locally, nationally, and internationally. Talk not just with those with the same ideas as yourselves, but with people who have diametrically different ideas. Knowledge is not just power, but also the road to solutions. Thank you very much.